May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. In the early 1990s, my husband and I attended graduate school at Columbia University in New York City. And one of the real gifts of living in married student housing, which was not really much of a gift, living in married student housing on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, was that we lived directly across the street from Riverside Park, which followed the shoreline down to 75th of the Hudson River. So every day I would lace up my shoes for a morning run through this beautiful tree-lined and traffic-free path of the park. I did that every morning and loved it until one day along my route I was mugged. It happened early in the morning during a remarkably strange moment in time when there just happened to be nobody around. I mean, the park was always filled with dog walkers and joggers and people strolling along. But in this one opportune moment of time, there was nobody there. I was jogging alone with my thoughts and my headphones in when two men came out of nowhere, grabbed me by the shoulders. My speed, you should know, was of no use trying to get away. There was a park bench on one side, which blocked my escape, and then the two men were on the other side, holding my shoulders. I was trapped, and in that moment, they aggressively demanded that I give them my money. But rather than fear in this moment, what struck me first was the absurdity of their request. Runners, at least none that I ever knew of, never hit the road with cash in their pockets. And foolishly, I felt compelled to educate them on this point. So I told them straight out that I was out for a run and that, of course, I had no money with me. And not surprisingly, perhaps, my argumentative side caught their attention. I clearly was not what they were expecting. But they were still determined not to leave this encounter with me empty-handed, so their plan B was demanding that I give them, and this definitely dates me here, that I give them my yellow sports Walkman. Do you remember those? You remember those? They were a cassette player, and I was running with it. And I wasn't particularly opposed to giving them my Walkman in exchange for my life, thank you. But what I wanted, what I really cared about, was the tape that was inside. Now remember, this is back in the day, before Apple Music or before Spotify, when you really had to work to make a playlist. Do you remember? You had to get a tape-to-tape cassette player. You had to rewind and forward to get your perfect song that you wanted. Then you had to wait for it to play and record. And you had to do that over and over and over again to get 90 minutes worth of music. There was 45 minutes on one side. You flipped the tape and you had to do it again for 45 more minutes. Now, for those of you who don't know, this took hours. It took days, actually, to make these mixtapes. And before my husband and I moved to New York City from Nashville, he had lovingly put all of our favorite country musics onto this tape, which was inside my yellow Walkman. So sure, I would hand over that Walkman, but not that tape. So I offered these two men a deal. I told them, you can have the Walkman, but I'm going to keep that tape that's inside. And then I followed with the most ridiculous thing I've ever said in my life. I said, it's country music, you won't like it. Now, I have said some really ridiculous things in my life, but I even shocked myself with that one. But at the same time, I clearly flustered these two men. They were out to do me harm. But then they immediately began to try and figure out how to open up this Walkman. I think I had out-crazied them. But they couldn't figure out how to open the latch, so I took it back. I demonstrated how to do it. I took the tape, and then I gave them the Walkman back, and off they ran. Now, trust me, I am going to get to the gospel. Just bear with me here. We're almost there. We're almost there. Later that day, I received a call from the precinct detective asking if I would come down to the station to identify the men who had later been captured. And there I found out that they had beaten every single person that they had encountered that day, except for me, with 2x4s. Everybody but me. And now I could be wrong, but I have always suspected that the reason that they didn't harm me was because I had engaged them in conversation. And yes, it was a crazy conversation, but it was a conversation nonetheless. I had looked them in the eyes, and I had even acknowledged that I didn't want to subject them to country music selections. So now, wrong or right, radically reckless or brilliantly creative, you choose. However you see this exchange between me and my attackers, it is probably the closest I've ever gotten, and maybe the only example in my life of living out Jesus' teaching from Luke's gospel this morning. Do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, love your enemies. And I have to say that today's passage is so difficult, and it's perhaps one of the most misinterpreted and misunderstood passages that Jesus is teaching, or lessons that Jesus is teaching his followers. Because you see, Jesus was not talking about being naive or allowing ourselves to be some sort of a passive victim or a non-reactive doormat. No, Jesus was not saying that. And he was not teaching that bullies should have the right of way either. But rather, Jesus is teaching, he's simply saying, do not retaliate violence with violence. Because Jesus abhors violence in response to evil. But at the very same time, Jesus abhors passivity. Jesus is teaching us that there is a different way. And in our world, which I know you and I both know, that undoubtedly includes bullies and aggressors and evil at every turn, and people who are wishing to do us harm, what Jesus is teaching us is how to be in this world with love. To be in this world as love. To be in this world as active love. There's nothing passive about it. Remember, love is patient. Love is kind. Love isn't envious or boastful. It doesn't dishonor others. It doesn't seek its own way. Love keeps no record of wrongs or holds no contempt, no judgment, no distrust, no disdain. And of course, love like this is not ever going to make it on the inside of some sentimental Hallmark card, that's for sure, because this kind of love is difficult, it is gritty, and it is sacrificial. Which love always leads us back to Jesus, who lived out that kind of love. Remember, toward the end of Jesus' life, when Judas, one of his closest friends and disciples, was about to betray Jesus? They had been together for years. They were devoted to each other until Judas threw all of that away to turn Jesus over to the Roman authorities. It was the ultimate betrayal. And I can only imagine how painful that must have been for Jesus. Have you ever been betrayed by a close loved one or a friend? It has to be the most painful experience, the deepest wound. But what did Jesus do? He loved Judas. He fed him bread and wine. He got up from the table. He tied a towel around his waist. He poured water in a basin, and then he washed Judas's feet. There were no punches thrown, no name calling, no how could you. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. In the face of evil and betrayal, Jesus loved. Now, love like this, in a world like this, almost seems foreign, right? Alien, almost. And if we dared to love like this, it would create a world where there is no us and them, where there are no boxes, there are no closets, no borders, no walls, no measuring, no counting, no judging, no competing. And shockingly, when you add all of that up, you know what you get? You get complete and perfect freedom. Freedom to be seen as God's beloved child, and freedom to see the person standing right next to you or across from you as God's beloved and perfect child as well. Freedom is the gift that you get when you follow the way of love. Now, loving the way that Jesus loved requires nothing short of transformation for us, truly. It requires practice. It requires creativity. It requires a bold trust in God's power. And of course, I want to be honest with you, I have failed at that more times than I can even begin to count. Through my attitude, through my words, through my actions, I have been the betrayer. I have been the bully. I have been and continue to be the aggressor. Don't drive on I-40 when I'm in the car. And worse, I have been blind to the needs and the brokenness of others. So it is with raw honesty that I confess what I have done, and I confess what I have left undone every week here in worship. But mercifully, because of God's perfect love, we get to try and try and try again. In so many ways, this love is otherworldly. But I know that every time that we respond with love in this world, that a world that anticipates and almost expects hate and force and violence or judgment, that we are ushering in a new world. And I am trying desperately to learn this way of love, and I am thrilled and happy that you are trying to learn that as well together with me. So now looking back, if only I could retrace my steps that morning in Riverside Park and do good to those who hate you and bless those who curse you. This time I think I would tell those men, it's country music. You might like it. Take the tape. Radically reckless, brilliantly creative. It's love. Amen.